Welcome, Hanna, to our two-question series. Hanna Higgins is solo author of Fluxus Experience, a book published by University of California Press in 2002, and a grid book from MIT Press in 2009, and co-editor with Douglas Kahn of Mainframe Experimentalism, Early Computing and the Foundations of Digital Art, which also occurred from University of California Press in 2012. She has received the University of Illinois, Chicago University Scholar Awards, DAAD Awards, Getty Research Institute grant, and Philip Collection, as well as Emily Harvey Foundation fellowships. Higgins is the daughter of Fluxus artist Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles, and is co-executor of the estate of Dick Higgins and the Something Else Press. Professor Higgins has been teaching at the University of Illinois, Chicago since 1994 and is the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Ideas BA in Art. Her research and course topics examine 20th century avant-garde art with a specific interest in Dadaism, Surrealism, Fluxus, obviously, happenings, performance art, food art, and early computer art. Her books and articles argue for the humanistic value of multimodal sensory cognitive experience. Hanna, thank you so much for joining me. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Okay, thank you so much, Hanna. This is I'm so delighted to be part of this archive. So what a wonderful pair of questions. I think the answer to the first question would be no. I do not believe that performance can be conserved. And that is because in a room with a performer, all of the senses are awakened, every one. We see, we hear, we smell, we may taste, we may experience touch, and we do not have a single mediating system that can capture all of that overlapping simultaneity and give it back to us. So this is different than, for example, conserving a painting, where it can be cleaned and returned to an approximation of what it was like to look at the painting in its materiality when it is conserved. So from the point of view of what performance is, my answer is definitely not. And in other instances, I've been misunderstood for taking what would seem to be the next position, which is to say, I'm also not in favor of reperformance. And the reason for that requires a definition, I think, of what I believe reperformance is. So reperformance involves an attempt to produce in the present moment an artifact that resembles all of that sensory material that I just laid out. And so its focus is on reiteration, presenting again. And what that means is that one always has a kind of divided eye, or divided nose, or divided tongue, or divided ears in trying to kind of understand that gap. It doesn't mean that reperformance isn't interesting. It's that the effort to produce resemblance across the senses takes the viewer, sitter, experiencer's attention away from the presentness of the possibility of whatever the situation is. So I do think performing again is very interesting and important. So this is a position against a kind of theatricalization of performance, where a historic performance becomes a piece of historic theater, right? Losing sight of what is possible in performance in favor of the incredible strength of the most simple gestures and actually even complex gestures to retain their immediacy over time, as long as at the moment when we're in that performance situation, we are able to be in it that in ways that are presentist, that are about total connectivity with the activity. And so this is why, if, something like Alan Capro's Fluids is so interesting to me, because Fluids, which is the rectangle of ice built, it's sort of like a small ice house, and then it's allowed to melt. Fluids is often performed in ways that are, I think, re-performative. The ladder gets placed in the right place so that the photograph resembles this past document. But then there are, and the name of these women escaped me, there was a group of women who did Fluids in California. I think it may have been at the Getty. And they simply, they did it, but it was completely their own. It wasn't goofballs. It wasn't, let's look like Capra. It was basically sort of a punk rock Ice Cube. And it was just beautiful.
So we can take this thinking to,
we can take thinking really to all of that kind of era of performance art, right? To what it's like to look at a Fluxus concert, for example. I really struggle with coming to a Fluxus concert and seeing, a row of bowler hats or costuming that feels retrograde, because for the audience member, they're basically finding themselves within a reconstruction in the service of a photograph. And I also want to say, however, while I don't think performance can be conserved, I do think that the documentation of performance is extremely important for what it does at the level of the imagination. And here I would follow someone like Amelia Jones, who, has been very, I think, precise in saying, look, I wasn't there. So what I will evaluate is what I can evaluate. And that is photographs and documentation and writing and all the wonderful, rich documents that the artists leave behind and that their documenters leave behind. And I love that attitude toward history, because it allows the reader, viewer to be truly creatively engaged with historic documentation. And this is where exhibitions like yours, Hanna, the Zen for Head, the Zen for Film, are, I think, absolutely critically important. It's neither re-performance. It is, in a sense, performance, not at the level of what happens when a person is in front of you doing the thing, but in terms of what happens in the efforts to reconstruct the activity in the viewer's mind. And that is also a non-duplicable element, which is why that too is a form of performance. You understand? It is not the same one person to the next, right? Why it matters, what it matters, how we imagine it. We're into the kind of, early days of semiotics in a sense, sort of how it all holds together. Now, this poses challenges for, say, the job of the historian, right? The job of the historian, as I understand it, we are bridge builders between the many directions material can have taken in its past and the many ways we are imagining what the present needs from that material and what the futurity of that material might be, which means historians tend to be homogenizers. It's our job to find ways of thinking about things that cause them to matter. And this idea of the kind of the archival performative, especially in connection to notions of conservation, creates tension in that functionality. And that's why my own historical writing is very clearly in these ideas as kind of separate camps, not easily resolved. And I want us to be able to use history that way. I've become very impatient with kind of normal standard art history when it is seen to be or treated as a kind of homogeneous field of meta narratives that any work can be plugged into, because this imaginative encounter is the mechanism through which new futures are imagined for things, and new missed gaps are exposed. It's why we write history about the same things over and over again, because the historian by definition always misses stuff. And so I have kind of creative writing that I do that I view as art historical and performative. And then I have writing that I do that is intentionally, huge views of topics like, the American flag, 300, 250, actually, what goes back before the founding of the country. So, 400 years across multiple zones, because I think that homogenizing dimension is really important. And then I also have these deep dives that I might do into, say, one piece that are very sensory and don't really worry too much about that overarching question. And I think it's important that is the lesson that I learned from trying to write about performance art, is exactly that issue. And it goes straight to the issue of conservation, because conservation can be a kind of freezing of something in time, or an attempt to return something to an originary moment, which may or may not have ever existed for a viewer. It also has this kind of complexity built into it. Sure. Well, so what does it mean to conserve performance? I suppose I would have to know what the model of conservation is that's in play. Because if the performance is conserved by collecting all the historic documents in one place and showing a video of a performer, I would say that is maybe a wonderful object, but if the viewer is told how to think about what they're seeing, then it is no longer a performance. In other words, the conservation can kill it easily. And that's where my problems with kind of goofball fluxus come into play. So I would be very cautious about what kind of direction the viewer gets, the experiencer gets, in terms of how the action of conservation is framed. That becomes that the interpretation of the act of conservation is probably as important, maybe even more important than the conservation itself. I still want things to be kept in acid-free boxes and away from light when possible and protected. But then when the information about a performance is confused with the performance itself, I'm really struggling. And maybe that, as I sit here, I think, oh, this is nostalgic because I was allowed, through the grace of whatever determines the way things are in the world, to spend my early life in the folds of, I guess, what could be called the original of a lot of this work, and to watch these artists age and continue to do the work and to watch it really transform. But I think what I want to say is the conservation of performance needs to be understood as let's put it this way: the conserved performance is a wonderful and necessary historic document, and it's all that most people can know. But it's not all that I would wish for most people to try to know. So in my classrooms, we do performances, not just Fluxus performances, but any performances that we can find to do. We do them, and I ask the students to try to do them authentically, in the sense of you're not here to personify Breton. You're not here to personify, you're not acting a role. And so it's not the same thing as conservation, but it is an attempt, I think, to conserve something else, which is the presentness and the immediacy of performance art. And it's very difficult to do, but because you're asking people to trust their peers with a kind of vulnerability, which is at the core of what makes performance for the artist, but also for the audience, such a rich experience. When you sit and you think, oh my God, what's going to happen? What is going to happen next? What is that person they're feeling as they do it? I am noticing this about that person. All of that internal mental stuff is what performance is, and it's impossible to conserve it. But I still like the documents. I mean, I have an archive. I have my father's materials. His papers are at Northwestern. I would be delighted if someone wanted to do a performance festival of that work. Nothing would make me happier. That would be great. And I would hope that in such an event there would be, interest in the tensions and complexities between archive, conservation, and actual performance. But to get back to that first question, I don't actually believe that performance itself can be conserved.